The purpose of life is not to be happy, it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate. To have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well. To make a change in someone else's life. And this is what exactly you at home, the country did on Friday. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. As we speak tonight, I want to remember those who died following the inclement weather conditions across the nation. 177 dead, 109 still missing. 557,505 people have been affected by the adverse weather. I want to pay a tribute to the security forces personnel, the Air Force, the Navy and the Army, together with the police, who stood strong, who stood with the people when they were in dire need of their help. And then on Friday, when we launched the Silva Shakti TV1 Sahana Yatra, you, the people, came on board once again. I have been with News First for the last 12 years, and every single time we have launched a relief campaign. You at home have helped your fellow countrymen. I recollect in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy struck in New York. There was an issue. The problem was no one was there for each other. It was just people alone. But just imagine something like that happens in a country like Sri Lanka. We have the people around those who are affected. And this is what exactly you did. I want to start tonight's show with a very simple message. Together as a nation, we can overcome any adversity. Together as a nation, we can help each other. Together as a nation, we will stand by those who have been affected. We will stand by the country, we will stand by the nation, and we will stand by this resplendent island nation. Tonight on the show, our topic of discussion is disaster risk reduction. How can we proactively move forward? What sort of steps must you at home take if there is adversity in the future? What should you do if you hear of a disaster in the future? It is not about the number of people who die at the end of the day. It's about saving at least one person's life. And that is the ethos, that is the very foundation of this media network as well. So let me introduce our guests this evening. Starting off, we have this evening Rear Admiral Piyal de Silva, Director General Operations, Sri Lanka Navy. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us this evening on the show. Also joining us this evening is Major General Mano, Perera, retired. He was a well-known face during the media by the landslides, did a lot of work. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us this evening as well. Also joining us this evening is Group Captain, retired, Mr. Firzan Hashim, Country Director of APAT Sri Lanka. Nice to have you on board as well, Mr. Hashim. Thank you very much for joining us, the three gentlemen representing the forces of this island nation. Also joining us this evening would be approximately at around 10 p.m. today is Group Captain Gihan, Senavirathne, Air Force spokesperson. He just called us and said that he was busy with some work. We don't want to disturb him, but we are expecting his arrival approximately at around 10 p.m. this evening. So let's start off tonight's show with retired Group Captain Mr. Firzan Hashim, Country Director of APAT Sri Lanka. Give us a situation update. What is the current forecast like? What is going to happen next? What is the situation right now in the country?
Yes. In fact, in addition to what you did say, what the country is looking for is these 2 days of forecast, whether there would be rain, that is 29th and the 30th. If we do not have rain, I think we will move on to the recovery process. As at now, there is a requirement where the people who are still stranded, who had to be taken care of. And the other is that to see how many have lost their lives following the disaster, that is waiting for help, and to figure out how best we can minimize that losses in the future.
Now, Mr. Hashim, with regard to the 109 people who are believed to be missing, what is the estimation like from an organization like a private entity that you are representing? What is the thought?
Yes, this is the concern that we have in respect to the previous disasters. Within a very short period that we lost so many lives. And talking about the missing personnel, whilst we take a proper account of them, whether they are alive or not, it is important to figure out how come that we lost so many lives in such a short time in Sri Lanka. We have had quite a lot of disasters, and which seems to be cyclic, and to see how well we were prepared. And even if there were messages to evacuate, what are the preparedness processes for evacuation? Whether there is a location where people could go to. What we also saw during the air reconnaissance we did the following day was massive inundation. Even if you had to move to a location, where would you move to? And even if you did move, that place too would have been inundated. So the concern is about how many more losses that we would have to incur in the future.
Now, we've seen something of this sort taking place last year during the same period, but the areas that were affected were a bit different. Do you think that we were not prepared enough to face this monsoon this time around?
To be fair too, even if you look at the last year's scenario, it was about urban flooding, something that was new to us, though we have had gone through quite a lot of other disasters in the rural areas. But the intensity of rain that we received on that particular day, or that particular night, it was very different as opposed to what we have had in the last few years. It would be good to figure out when did we have that amount of rain last, and to see how did we respond to that. Even when you look at the aerial view of what actually had occurred the following day, the amount of water which had reached levels where people would have no way of evacuating, even if you had given them enough time, a day's time. Even if you had a day's time, if you did move out, where would you move out? All those areas were inundated. So in comparison, what I would see is that in an urban area you have a place to go. You would find so many other locations or buildings that you could go up to, but in these flat locations, areas, there is no way that even if you could get away, that you would have a high-rise location or buildings that you could go up to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Firzan Hashim. He's also a retired group captain, country director of APAD, Sri Lanka. I now move my attention to Rear Admiral Piyal de Silva, Director General Operations, Sri Lanka Navy. First of all, Mr. de Silva, hats off to the Navy. A wonderful job. Many organizations who were providing relief were able to get to most parts of the country thanks to the Navy. 6 districts have been affected. Your boats, your personnel have been deployed in all 6 districts that have been affected. What is the situation like right now? Have you all been able to reach every nook and cranny in the flood affected areas?
Usually in any flood situation, Sri Lanka Navy is the first responder to reach the location and give whatever possible assistance to rescue people and provide the relief that they require. So 6 districts have been affected this time, and we were able to provide our assistance swiftly to all the districts when necessary.
When it comes to reaching the locations, Ms. De Silva, have your organization, has the Navy been able to reach to every house in the affected areas to see whether there are survivors in these locations in question?
It's very difficult to reach every house in a flood situation, but our troops deployed on ground somehow go to the location that are feasible to reach and rescue people. In certain the visuals you would have seen some people creeping through the very tiny gaps of the houses and rescuing people and bringing them to safe location in order to have some kind of safety for them.
Mr. Silva, it's quite surprising to see on certain instances, even when evacuation alarms have been brought to the notice of the residents, they still don't move from their houses. Why is that?
That's a very common phenomenon in Sri Lanka. People do not want to leave until they feel that the water level is really going up. Therefore, they don't leave the house. So, for the troops that are deployed on ground, move from place to place and advise them to leave, but still they don't leave. So, when they realize that their life is in really threat only, they tend to leave.
Mr. Silva, when it comes to individuals, what must they really do when they hear of a flooding in a particular area? Or let's say they're stranded in a particular location, how can they reach even the Navy or any helping organization? Let's say electricity has been cut off completely, they don't have any access to phones. How can they reach the Navy or any other organizations? Any system in place, mechanism in place?
Usually we get the information from Disaster Management Center where the place affected, and then we plan our path to find the access to the affected location, and through that path we reach the location. We have experienced in the past and as well as in this particular incident where the access route is blocked by obstacles. So in such situations we find alternative routes, and that takes time to reach the affected area. So somehow we managed to reach the location and provide the assistance. In certain occasions, Air Force has helped us immensely to airlift our boats to the required location and provide the assistance to the affected people.
Mr. Silva, let's say someone is stranded inside a house. Let's say there's no way that he or she can tell the authorities over the phone that they are stuck inside the house. How can they inform the authorities? Is there any particular way can they use some sort of signal to tell that they are stuck in this particular location? What must they really do?
In fact, it is the common sense that they can use. If they create any kind of smoke or whatever possible signal that they could make would be detected by the Navy patrolling in that area for the rescue mission, and by looking at the distress signal they would respond immediately. So it's very difficult to go from house to house and rescue people, but our people try their level best to reach even the places that are not accessible by boat to reach the location and rescue the people.
Thank you very much, Rear Admiral Piyal de Silva, Director General Operations, Sri Lanka Navy. So what is important to understand is the fact that if you are stranded in a particular house and if there's a flood situation, you have to make a distress signal for the authorities to detect you. One way is smoke. You can have a little bit of a small fire. Again, be very cautious, and then you can signal to the authorities that you are in a particular location, stranded and needing help. I now move my attention to Major General Mano Perera, who was very instrumental as far as the media by the landslide was concerned. You were in the spotlight at that time. I want to pose a question to you. I may be a little bit pessimistic here, Mr. Perera, but there are 109 people missing. You saw the media by the landslide as well. And one of the assumptions that were made was those who were missing are presumed dead. Now you have 109 people missing. What is your estimation like?
Well, the situation is slightly different. That was one location, and we could estimate the damage, the extent of damage, and also although I have said that we declared them dead, not exactly. We had to continue with our relief operations as far as possible, and only at a stage when we could confirm that there was no more possibility for them to survive, we decided, with the consent of the families and those of that particular village, to declare them as dead. But then there is also another process that is involved in that, which is part of civil administration. There is a element called SOCO in the police. You would have seen vehicles with SOCO, that is scene of crime officials. They had to be present on those locations. They have to give us the green light to declare somebody dead. And even if a corpse is found, it is they who will identify and take the necessary legal action to prevent or to make sure that it is within the legal framework that to declare them as dead or missing. So there is a process that is involved.
Mr. Perera, you said that this situation is different to the situation that we're experiencing right now.
Yeah.
Because it is not one location, and there are 6 districts that have been affected. What is your presumption like as far as the number of dead are concerned? Do you think that there is a possibility for this number to increase further, or do you think that the authorities will be able to find these people stranded at their residences? What do you think?
Yes. Now this involves different kinds of hydrometeorological disasters. There is landslide, there are mudslides, there is floods, and sometimes maybe flash floods where people get washed away, and drowning due to inundation, marooning of people. So it's a vast majority of incidents that we are considering as one particular activity right at the moment. So when a person is subjected to incident of that nature, or he becomes a victim of an incident of that nature, we'll have to study the situation and see whether there is any possibility for him to survive. It depends on the terrain around him, it depends on the conditions around him. If there is even a slight opportunity of him having a mode of survival, maybe an opportunity to breathe some food somewhere, to hang on to something, yes, then we can't declare him dead just because the area is marooned, or just because the people say no, he cannot be recovered. So it has always been the focus and the aim of the security forces to try their ultimate best to recover the person and to carry on with the relief operations, the rescue operation, till the very last moment.
Mr. Perera, before I move to Group Captain Gihan Senavirathne, Air Force spokesperson who just arrived, do you think that we were well prepared to face this monsoon, this situation?
Let me tell you, if we study the disaster profile of Sri Lanka, there are proven facts, there are facts that have been published by authentic sources, that since 2006, the number of disasters that have been occurring for a year has increased more than threefold, more than fourfold. So obviously, we have seen the results of that over the past years. Since 2006, the intensity of disasters setting in, whether it's drought, whether it's cyclonic storms, gale force winds, floods, rains, landslides, all these are disasters. A disaster is defined when that particular community which is affected by the disaster is unable to cope with it within the resources that are available to them. So when it comes to a situation of that nature, well, the country should have known, the respective authorities should have been aware that this was setting in.
And you would say that proactive action should have been taken by the authorities.
We were talking about disaster risk reduction. Disaster risk reduction also involves various factors, and that is, the first and foremost is identifying the vulnerability. And then you raised the question as to why people did not leave. When you assess vulnerability, there are some salient factors that you have to consider. That is, where do people live? Why do people live there? Where do people live? That's the location that they are living. Why do they live there? There is a reason for that. Maybe their livelihoods are dependent on the particular location. Maybe the habitats are close to the mode of communication. There is a specific reason as to why they are living in that particular place. And then, how do they make a living? These are all connected to the level of vulnerability that a society can be exposed to. And then what is important for them to protect. when the livelihoods are threatened, when the sources of livelihoods are threatened, not only them, even you and I would think twice of leaving it and going. They are taking the example of media Badda. There were a lot of feedback from authorities saying that they informed them well ahead. Definitely yes. When we went into detail, we found that there had been early warning given to this very location, the people of that village 5 years before, saying that they are vulnerable to landslides. The area is vulnerable to landslide, identified as a danger zone. They were given alternate housing, locations for alternate housing, assistance. But then, because their livelihoods were dependent on that particular area, connected to the estates and the surrounding, they did not move out. They remain.
Thank you very much, Major General Mano. Some interesting thoughts indeed. When you're looking and figuring out why people are stranded in particular locations, one thing has to be taken into account: what is their livelihood? Why are they living in that particular location? Are some important things that have to be kept in mind. I now move my attention to Group Captain Mr. Gihan, Senavirathne, Air Force spokesperson. First of all, my condolence to the Air Force personnel who died during the rescue operations that took place as far as the inclement weather conditions were concerned during the last few days. My condolences to the Air Force as well as the family of the deceased Air Force personnel. Coming back to some bolts and nuts with regard to what happened this morning, the crash of the Mi-17 helicopter. Tell us, make us a bit cognizant about what exactly happened.
Right. First and foremost, let me say that we would refrain from using the word crash. Okay. It was not a crash, it was actually a forced landing. And what happened this morning was that the helicopter was approaching the Badagama area. It was carrying fresh food and dry rations to be given to the people affected in that area. And as the pilot approached to land, he experienced an emergency. Now, that is a common enough phenomenon with helicopters, and what the helicopter pilot is trained to do is that when such a thing happens, he has to find the nearest safe place to land. Now, in this particular situation, he was looking at the ground which is covered in water. So now a helicopter has to have a flat land to land on. So he didn't have an option, he kept the aircraft down. Now, it is to the credit of the pilot's skills that nobody was injured. So now I would assume that we have lost that aircraft. Now, there is a very good likelihood that we have lost that aircraft. The extent of damage may be fairly bad, and with the water situation as it is, we are not able to determine the exact nature of the damage. And as to the exact cause of the damage, again, we are not able to determine that at this stage in time. However, what did happen was actually a very good illustration of the dangers that are involved in situations like this. Now, these are the dangers that these pilots are trained to handle, and again, something that we take as part and parcel of what we do. So the aircraft experienced a failure. It landed. There was a 10-man crew on board, the 5 air crew and 5 Regiment Special Forces personnel who were part of the rescue team. They were all safe. So again, like I said, it's to the credit of the pilot who managed to set the aircraft down without further damage.
Group Captain Senavirathne, kudos to the team and the pilot who was in command at that time during the forced landing, as you did mention. What has been the role of the Air Force in this situation, in particular the last 6 days? Yeah,
okay, let me start off by saying what the Air Force brings into this equation is what we call air power. Now, air power is what the Air Force of any nation exercises, and that see, air power has a number of characteristics that make it invaluable in situations like this. Now, air power, for instance, has the characteristic of speed. It has the characteristic of reach, both of which help us to do what maybe the other forces or the other personnel on ground and on the surface of the sea can do. See, we can reach where other people can't reach, and we can get to places faster because we use the medium of air. So that is what we bring, what the Air Force brings into the equation. So that in itself, now that again, now if you look at the most developed and the most resource abundant Air Force in the world is the US Air Force. Now even the US Air Force, if you ask them, will tell you that they will never have enough resources or enough air power to deploy in a given situation. So it is very critical that whatever air power that we have in any country, that we direct it judiciously, that we use it judiciously. So it is that is the challenge of air power. So we have certain limited resources that have a great capacity for assistance in a situation like this, but it is never enough. So the idea is that we bring in reach and speed, and we also have to be mindful of the fact that reach and speed has to be employed or deployed where it is absolutely necessary. So there was a lot of speculation in the last few days about, some people, especially on ground, will say, okay, nobody helped us to get out of this place. We were in trouble. The Air Force didn't come. So that is a common enough allegation. But the fact of the matter is that, especially with the Air Force, now if you look at, if you have seen the visuals of the last few days, the commander of the Air Force himself took control of an aircraft in the last couple of days. He flew around. The idea again is that another characteristic of air power is that you can get a bird's eye view of the situation and get an idea, an overall picture of what is happening on ground. So the Air Force commander did that for the particular reason, for the simple reason that by seeing what is happening on ground, he can determine what is the best way to do this, and also where best to employ this air power that we have, this rare resource or limited resource called air power. Where can it be deployed effectively? So that is where the Air Force comes into play in a situation like this.
Thank you very much, Group Captain Gihan Senavirathne. I recollect you were not here when Rear Admiral Piyal de Silva, Director General Operations, Sri Lanka Navy, made a tribute to the Air Force, saying that because of the Air Force, they were able to deploy their Navy boats in particular and in certain locations that were not even sometimes accessible. So I thought I'll bring that to your attention as well, because that was discussed during your absence. It is, at the end of the day, a collective effort. The military, the police, and the people, that is you at home, trying to help in whatever way you can, in whichever way you can, to those who are in dire need of your help. So let me open the floor for questions from our journalist. On to my right is Nadim Majid, as always. On to my immediate left is Sonali Vanikabadig, attorney at law. And on to my far left is Charita Fernando. I think Charita can start off tonight's session, but I just want to make a certain submission. Charita's husband is also a serviceman, ex-serviceman. Gave so much to the country, and today is one of the very people who have been able to safeguard our nation. And he was injured following an explosion. But at the end of the day, what is important is today you are safe at home because of individuals like them. So let's start off tonight's show, tonight's session with Charita.
Thank you, Sham.
Yes.
My first question is to General Perera. You mentioned about the frequency of natural disasters and the intensity of it. And we also know that this part of the region is also called the world's hazardous belt, right? The Indian Ocean region. So since you're retired now, can you give us an independent assessment of Sri Lanka's preparedness for disasters, to face disasters?
Well, you put me into a bit of a trouble, but to be very frank, we have come a long way. If you study the disaster preparedness and disaster response that we have been carrying out in this country, if you could remember, prior to the tsunami in 2003, there was a quite serious flooding of almost of similar nature, and in the similar areas. That's especially in the south, in Matara, in Deniaya, all these areas. There are a lot of areas made inaccessible due to inundation. And at that time there was no disaster management in place. Therefore, there was no proper military-civil coordination, nor was there any relief coordination done in a systematic manner. But since then, we have come a very long way. Over the years, when disasters occurred, if you take the number of casualties that have taken place, or people who have become casualties, numbers have dwindled day by day. Other tsunami was an event where the world was really unable to cope with. But then, rest of the things, we have managed to bring down the number of casualties over the years. So, on that, I should congratulate the disaster management for achieving some degree of success. But then, when we consider what happened in Aranayaka, the floods thereafter, and even this, my personal opinion is that our level of preparedness was far less than it should have been. We have a meteorological department which could predict this, the volume of or the density of rain that could fall, the area, and the volume of water that is going to flow down the rivers. I have a bit of an experience on this. Last time when the flood occurred, I was in service. I was just about to retire. Since I am involved in disaster management, knowledge sharing and knowledge enhancement activities over the years, and even Hashim knows about it. There was an occasion when I had the opportunity of asking these Met Department personnel as to why they did not inform the people down the river towards Kalaniya, Meethatamulla, those areas, or Kolonnava, Vellampitiya, those areas, as to why they did not inform them that the volume of water is going to increase over a period of time. I got a very nice answer. They said, no, we don't do that, it's the responsibility of the irrigation department. Of course, that's how I've been functioning in this country. But let me tell you, all this has been laid down on paper. The Disaster Management Act number 13 of 2005 clearly defined a disaster management national disaster management mechanism for the country, which is headed by none other than the President himself and co-chaired by the Prime Minister. All the ministers of line ministries are involved. The tri-services heads are involved, and it goes down to the grassroots level of divisional secretaries.
Major General Perera, there are 22 individuals in this particular committee that you're talking about. Correct me if I'm wrong.
22 men, and there are many others who will be supporting. And this structure cascades down to district level and below. Finally, according to the Disaster Management Act, the first respondent should be from the vulnerable community itself. They say the village committee, but which is not practical. The vulnerable community cannot react to a disaster, because the disaster definition itself very clearly states that when the community is unable to cope with its own resources, that is termed as a disaster. When the risk increases, the hazard increases into a risk, and it becomes a disaster. That is how it happens. So that's why I say the preparedness was not enough. Mechanism is in place, but there was no coordination within this mechanism. The early warning, yes, should have been done. Disaster management follows a cycle, which starts with the impact, then the response, which is normally in the world, it's the system in vogue. That's the nation's armies or the nation's militaries are the first respondent, because that's most well trained, well equipped.
So, General, where do you see the problem here? Now, you said there's a lack of coordination, right?
Exactly. That's where the problem is.
Yeah. So, how can you put it right? How do you suggest to put it right?
Well, the little experience that I have in handling this type of disasters, the stakeholder management is the biggest problem today. There are few reasons for that. Some of the stakeholders, especially the civil administration, they are empowered legally to carry out action, but they don't have the resources to do that. If you go down to the district level, under the district secretary, there are disaster management assistant directors, and that's about it. Whom is he going to use for early warning? Whom is he going to use for response? He has to come back to the military.
How do you rate the use of technology, like, you know, SMS or internet? There are so many ways that you can get a message across. You've been involved in disaster management situations. What do you think of the public sector and the use of technology to disseminate information?
I'm not sure whether you are aware. This early warning through messages is being carried out. But unfortunately I don't think it reaches the public. It reaches only those who are involved in disaster management. But this is a source that could be made available to everybody, because today the mobile communication, the resource that is available, is accessible to every individual. So that's the best source of communication available to us.
Mr. Hashim, do you agree with Major General Mano Perera when he says that no proactive steps were taken by the authorities to prevent this calamity in terms of the deaths at least?
In fact, it's about not blaming anybody, but then to look at, as the General said, what has been frequent and what is the action that we have taken. See, for example, if you are in a layman's language to explain about disaster, what it would say is that these are hazards, the rain, what the winds and so are hazards. But then who creates the disasters? It is we who create our own disasters. For example, if you know that something is, if there is a hillock which is said that there would be landslides and so on, and if you go and build a house right down there, you are prone to a disaster. But if you build it somewhere else, you will not be prone to a disaster.
So you're saying the public also have to play a major role?
Exactly. It's about the attitude. It's also about the awareness. And what I would see is that how you could institutionalize DRR in all aspects of life, whether it is businesses and whether it is the curriculum of the children. You look at how the children could be, basically their frame of mind could be put into DRR, disaster
risk.
But
then Hashim, then there's a problem, what General Mano Perera said, your livelihood surrounds in a particular location. And how would attitude come into play then? Because at the end of the day, you want to stay in that location because its access is free for you, very close by. You work in the estate sector like the media bed, the landslide issue that I'm just talking about, referring to. Does it really come into play?
Yes. See, there are locations where you cannot move out, livelihood, your property, which is so expensive, you can't go. Then what are the mitigations that you could take? For example, if you have your home and if you know the water level does come up to this level, if you can't raise the whole house, what you do is raise one room to a level which will be above water, where you could take care or rather ensure that you could go up there and have all your documents and children and so on up there in case of a flooding or so on. The other is that, see, what are we talking about sustainable development? Following the tsunami, we did see the schools coming up in the coasts, which were done by so many agencies and even the government and so on. And they also created the top floor, a concrete top floor, as a safe location during a tsunami for children and people to go up and to be secure there. So in each of our construction, we should be looking at how best there is development, and that development to be sustainable, and not to look at see for the moment. And when you are talking about that, I would like to see what is the role of the authorities which do provide authority to build houses. We have different levels of authority, whether it is the provincial council or the district secretariat. How do they work together? And is DRR incorporated into this approval mechanism?
Group Captain Gihan Senavirathne, disaster risk reduction is an important component in today's day and age. At the end of the day, if you can even save one person's life, that is the future, that is the victory for anyone. What do you think should be the role of individuals, like the people, because you all were involved in this disaster, post-disaster situation. What is the message that you have for the public? What must they do in order to not be stranded in a particular house? What sort of message do you have for them?
Yes. Well, like someone said, I don't know about the first thing that comes to mind in a situation when I heard that question is that it's not so much now, especially in the last few days. What we have noticed is not so much what they should do, but what they shouldn't do. I think that we are all familiar with a number of issues where people got into trouble because they went to see what was happening. Now that is happening a lot around, especially with children. Now in situations like floods, in situations like what is happening today, there are occasions where numerous people have gone to see what is happening. They were not in trouble, but they went in to find out what was happening. It was just curiosity. So that type of thing is just, to put it simply, that's asking for trouble. So things like that, it's attitude where they, if you're at home and you encounter a flood, that is something that you can't do anything about. But if you go into a situation where you are ultimately putting yourself at risk, that is simply stupidity, right? So that is happening, and that is, I mean, it's laughable if you talk of it in this context, but it is actually happening. So that is one thing that we can do. Then also, like someone said, was already mentioned, there now somebody mentioned the word technology. Now today we have developed quite a bit. We are living in the 21st century. Technology is such that we have so many means of communication, we have so many means of predicting what is going to happen. Now, as was already brought up, a lot of prior notice was given that this disaster was coming. Sometimes what happens is, even though technology is informing us, we, because of our maybe reticence to listen to it, or our doubts, our lack of confidence in those systems, we don't heed those warnings, and that in turn will lead to further disaster. So that is, I think, especially living in the 21st century as we are today, with all this technology that is there to assist us, if we don't make use of that, if we don't heed those warnings, then we are to blame. We can't blame anyone else. We can't point the finger at anyone else for getting ourselves into a disaster.
Admiral de Silva, I wanted to ask you, the Navy responded very well in terms of the flood situations in many parts of the country. We saw several images of sailors pulling people out of their homes onto boats from areas where entire floors were flooded. What were the major challenges that the Navy faced in carrying out the rescue effort?
As I mentioned before, the major challenge for us in recent flood was to reach the required destination instantly. So as we have observed, most of the roads have been obstructed by obstacles. We could not reach the location. So once reaching the location, it is not a problem for our people to reach the affected places and render assistance as required. So other than that, I can mention that the water flow in certain areas also became a challenge for us. In certain areas we had to cross the very strong water streams to reach some locations. So, but our troops, our sailors were brave enough to cross such locations also and reach the houses and render assistance as required.
General Perera, you mentioned about first responders around the world, how you get the, usually it's the military forces, but you also get local fire and rescue units, ambulance services, etc., that are also first responders in disaster situations we've seen. Do you think that enough resources are being, or enough attention is being focused on the importance of local fire and rescue and ambulance service, paramedics, etc., in Sri Lanka?
Well, if you consider the standard of our fire and rescue, I think we have a little more distance to travel, distance to improve, a target to be achieved. But I should say, like I said earlier, it's a system in vogue in all over the world, that the first respondents are the nation's militaries, the Army, Navy, the Air Force. It's not something that is peculiar to us, even to the US or any other force, any other country. That is because these are people who belong to the government. They are paid by the government, trained by the government, kept by the government for this type of requirements. Who are the best contingency managers? The military, because that's their life. That's what they are paid for. That's what they are trained for. So that's why we say they are the first responders. But there is also another underlying factor which should not be overlooked. Disaster response is a specialist task. For those, the military cannot act. Military is definitely the first respondent, but as you said, fire and rescue is a specialized task. All military personnel cannot do that. Even rescue of personnel, every military personnel cannot do that. There is something called INSARAG training, which is part of UN standard of training, I should say in layman language. There are special teams that has to be trained for this, and there is a certain level of training that they have to achieve, and once they achieve that training, they have to be certified. Only then they can be sent into special or very serious disaster conditions for rescue. Otherwise, if every other soldier, every other airman, every other naval personnel is used for rescue, he would know as to how to rescue an injured person, how to rescue a person in a particular, under a particular situation, what the conditions are. So you need special training, all right, but then as a bulk force, first responders always in the military, because if you are trying to gather somebody else, harness the resources from somewhere else, you have to pay money. It takes time, but these are resources that are available at any given time. You have logistics, you have communications, you have the manpower, you have the train card.
Admiral De Silva, General Perera spoke about the coordination and the efficiency that you see in the tri-services when it comes to being first responders. Earlier he also spoke about you don't tend to see that focus or that level of efficiency among local authorities. Can you give us some insight into how exactly the coordination works once a disaster situation is declared, once the disaster management center gets in touch with, for example, the Navy? What's the process from there on?
When the disaster management center comes to know about the impending threat, they inform us through the office of the Chief of Defence Staff, and for that we respond. The moment we get the information, we keep our area commanders informed about the threat and ask them to prepare themselves to respond swiftly to the disaster. As seafarers and Navy deploy vessels out at sea throughout the month, we are also very vigilant about the weather pattern. Therefore, sometimes before the disaster management center informs us about the inclement weather, we come to know about the weather deterioration and keep our area commanders informed well in advance to be prepared. Then these respective areas follow the standard operation procedure in getting ready for the disaster, in preparing all the resources that are required to respond swiftly.
Group Captain Senavirathne, do you think that we have the right logistics? Because I'm well aware that the Mi17 helicopters are used as a transport, a two-turbine transport helicopter. Do we have the logistics at the Air Force in a situation like this? Obviously, this is not the primary task of the Air Force to be transporting goods for the public in a disaster situation, but do you think we have the logistics on board right now in a situation like this to cope up?
Okay, now if you look at it, if you ask us whether we have the logistics here, we can always have better logistics, definitely. But yes, I think that now the Mi-17, you explained, you refer to the Mi-17. Mi-17 is actually a medium utility helicopter. So they are by role defined to be used for utility. So utility means we can either transport troops, like we can transport it, we can actually use it, we can configure it for military use, or we can configure it to civilian use. So that is definitely a useful aircraft to have. The Bell 212, again, the workhorse of the Air Force. Before the Mi-17s came about, the Bell 212 was the one that was used for our sea rescue. So all of that. So the in terms of the facilities, the equipment that we need, yes, we do have most of the equipment. And the other thing is that you know what you said about you know the Air Force does not have disaster management as its primary role. Yes, we do have it as a secondary role, and because it is not one of our primary role, we cannot acquire resources specifically designed for that. Now, especially in a country like ours where we don't have unlimited resources, that is not something that we can do. So it's a matter of adapting it. It's a matter of adapting what we have to the need that we have. And these aircraft, especially the Mi-17s, the Bell 212s, the Bell aircraft in general, are fairly adaptable. So I would say that we do have the resources. Yes, if we have more of these, we'd be happy. I think we'll be able to do a better job, but we'll never have enough. You know, at the end of the day, we will never have enough.
Group Captain Gihan, point taken, we will never have enough. There's always room for improvement. When it comes to rescue operations, we know that the Jayhawk helicopters used by the US Coast Guard for rescue operations is quite vividly used right now. We see this in countries like Nepal, Bangladesh. Do we have Jayhawk helicopters with us?
No, we do not.
Do you think that there is a need for us to purchase these helicopters in a situation where there are issues with rescue operations in a country like Sri Lanka at the moment, in particular?
Right, okay. Now at some point in the past, I think this issue, I won't say specifically the Jayhawk, but I think the idea of buying aircraft or acquiring aircraft or air assets specifically for the role of disaster management was addressed. Now it's about, how would I say, to put it in a very offhandish way, bang for the buck. You know, you buy something, when we buy something, we buy it, especially in countries like ours, we buy something that we can utilize in multiple roles. So you buy something specifically geared for search and rescue only, we are wasting that resource. Until now, let's say for instance, now yes, we do have a increased frequency in this year's, you know, in the last couple of years of disasters, but if we don't have disasters, I mean, God forbid, we don't want disasters to happen every week. So we have aircraft that are on ground. So these aircraft are very expensive equipment. So we have to buy aircraft that we can utilize in multiple roles. So this is what I think the best configuration that we have is to use multi-role aircraft.
Thank you very much, Group Captain Gihan Senavirathne. We now go in for a short commercial break. We're talking about disaster risk reduction. Are we proactively geared up to take on the future? Because at the end of the day, disasters are not about taking a reactive approach. Even so, if that's the case, post-disaster recovery is important. We'll discuss all this and more after a short commercial break. Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be right back.